Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. The usual drill, we will just wait 1 or 2 minutes until everyone has joined the Zoom link. Thank you. Okay, so maybe just 1 more minute and then we will slowly start the webinar. Okay, so hello and thank you everyone for joining our webinar, Don't Gas Africa, an Intercontinental Exchange. My name is Jessica Besch. I am the Program and Engagement Manager at Climate Reality Europe. Please feel free, as Courtney already mentioned in the chat, to introduce yourselves as well. Together with our colleagues from the Africa branch, we want to warmly welcome everyone in the audience and also our 3 amazing speakers who will be introduced to you soon. We are looking forward to the discussions with all of you today, and we ask you to please put your comments and questions in the chat. And as you probably also seen, the session is being recorded and also live streamed on our Facebook channel. So quickly, for those of you who haven't heard about the Climate Reality Project yet, the international NGO was founded by former US Vice President Gore, and with 11 branches around the world, it is dedicated to catalyzing a global solution to the climate crisis. And around 40,000 activists, organizers, scientists have been trained in climate activism, almost 4,000 of them in Europe and around 1,600 in Africa. The Europe branch's programmatic areas include Path to Zero, Just Energy Transition and Climate Justice, all crucial topics that we will touch upon today. With the war in Ukraine and sanctions against Russia, Europe's energy security is under threat, all while experiencing a global climate emergency. And the new Dash for Gas will slow down Europe's and Africa's transition plans and add a neo-colonial dimension to it. The climate crisis, as we all know, is already immensely impacting those communities that have contributed the least to global greenhouse gas emissions. The new gas extraction plants in Africa will lock the continent further into fossil fuels instead of moving towards a green future powered by renewable, affordable, and accessible energy for all. And as climate activists and active citizens who acknowledge Europe's colonial past and also their responsibility towards the climate crisis, we should therefore build networks of solidarity with African civil society, and also listen to the needs and desires of the people on the ground. The Africa and Europe branch want to use this momentum prior to COP27 to send a clear and unified message. So we hope that today's webinar will uncover the false narrative circulating in Europe and beyond around gas as a clean energy source, but also highlight the need for a global and just energy transition away from fossil fuels and really center climate justice at the heart of our collective response to the climate crisis. We will hear short input statements by branch managers Zsolt Bauer and Amy Gilliam-Thorpe, and then followed by the presentation from our three speakers. And afterwards, we have some time for Q&A. And I would now like to hand it over to Zsolt, the branch manager for Climate Reality Europe.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you all for joining us today about this really important topic, how to bring closer Europe and Africa on a more sustainable, more resilient way than it is in the handbook of the politicians and some business people as well. So a year ago in Glasgow at COP26, one of my former colleagues, Robert Filczak, who now is a professor at the Academy of Sciences in Slovakia, made a speech about the most important factors that influences our political systems, political decisions related to just transition in Central Europe, or as we call it in the former Soviet Russian controlled region. Preparing for this event, I felt that his speech resonates very well with the current situation in many ways. His remarks were connected to the following three overarching issues. The first issue which Robert Filczak mentioned is the right to grow. Year by year, we report the well-being of a country and the society with numbers like GDP, investment rate, salary increase rate, or numbers of cars sold. Even if we know, even if science warns us regularly that these numbers do not reflect how happy, healthy, resilient our society is, our political system is still built around those numbers, creating the false concept that we all have the right to grow, to benefit against other communities, to benefit against other nations, to exploit faraway resources without understanding or taking care of the consequences on the society or the ecosystems. The second issue, what he mentioned, is about that market rules. When the richest 1% of the planet owns around 50% of the wealth, rich people are richer every year, every day, due to their economic and lobby power, resulting special tax breaks, tax havens for them. The multinational companies owned by these persons get directly the subsidies, enjoy tailor-made legislation, while local small and medium enterprises, members of the community, pay the full tax and become naked suppliers of those large corporations. The third topic which was mentioned, the third issue which was mentioned by Robert Filczak, by Professor Robert Filczak, was the lack of solidarity. And I would like to complete it with that it's not only the lack of solidarity, but the fake political narratives, the fake political promises. So why do we accept the false concept of right to grow and market rules? Why don't we all in Africa, in Europe, all over the planet, raise our voice, do not use our choice, and do not vote against those powers? Because of lack of solidarity and fake political promises, fake political narratives. We live in the bubble of the social media, where easy to match community groups against the society, where politicians promise a heaven and often deliver a hell. These are much connected to the stretching questions of climate justice, undelivered promises of climate financing, and uncovered compensation for loss and damage. Is there a way out from this crisis accelerated by the Russian aggression, the suddenly realized energy security challenges, and the greedy fossil lobby? Can we avoid stepping into the same river and keep developed world's economy as usual, locking in fossils, natural gas for decades into our energy system, when the price will be again paid by continents like Africa? Or just going back to the words of our founder and chairman, the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, must we change? Can we change? Will we change? I think we have to send a clear message across the continents that there are limits to growth. We have the solutions that can address the energy security locally, avoiding neo-coloniality of extraction in 2022 and beyond. We must rebuild the bridges between developed and undeveloped countries on a fair, resilient, and just way. As we demanded in our statement on the occasion of the European Union African Union Summit in February this year, the cooperation of the two continents must be built on win-win relations. The economic relationship between the two continents must be based on mutually beneficial solutions that eliminate pressure on the environment and create opportunities for sustainable economic growth. Support must be given to building a qualified labor market by empowering workers with skills and knowledge. Investments in all economic sectors, but especially in renewable energy technologies, should flow to small and medium-sized enterprises, helping them to grow and expand. Support must also be given to civil society organizations, to NGOs, involved in the implementation of renewable energies at a micro level in order to ensure a just and inclusive energy transition. So we must transform the EU relationship with Africa into one of equal partners. It must represent a significant step towards a more just and sustainable future for both continents. Or, as Mr. Gore likes to say, let us all say, yes, we will change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jolt, for that input. And welcome everybody once again. My name is Courtney Morgan, and I am the campaigner for the African Climate Reality Project. We're now going to go into our speakers. And so thank you for those welcoming remarks by both Jessica and Jolt. We will now be hearing from Amy Gilliam-Thorpe, who is the branch manager of the African Climate Reality Project, which is a program at Food and Trees for Africa. She holds an honors degree in international relations from the University of Pretoria and a master's in sustainable development. She started her career as a researcher at the Center for the Study of Governance Innovation at the University of Pretoria and has worked with justice-focused organizations such as Amnesty International. Amy has a passion for environmental justice, gender equality, and sustainable food systems. She's a strong believer in putting passion and words into action. So we will now hear from Amy, who will give us an overview of resource extraction in Africa so we can set the scene and set the foundation for our talk going forward. Over to you, Amy.
Thanks so much, Courtney, and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, and I think just a really big thanks to Courtney and Jessica in particular, who've done a lot of the work in organizing today's event, but also to everyone else behind the scenes. And so I think, like Courtney said, it's really important to start today's conversation by unpacking and understanding the historical context of resource extraction in Africa and its link to colonialism. And I think also to see and understand how many of these trends are continuing today. What I will say is that in the time that we have for this conversation, and particularly for my presentation, that this is by no means exhaustive. So it's really just an overview. And I do encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to do more digging, more research on your own to understand some of these concepts and topics in more detail. So moving then into just really the history around resource extraction in Africa. And I think the first point to say is that resource extraction from foreign powers, countries, investors is not new. And that it can really be traced back to the scramble for Africa in the 19th century. And so for those of you who don't know, the scramble for Africa unfolded through a series of events. Some of those entailed the European interest in the Suez Canal, to European colonization in South Africa, but then also the Berlin Conference of 1884. And that's often most cited as the starting point for the scramble for Africa. And really at the time, Germany was emerging as a colonial power in Africa, and this caused key tensions with other key powers like Britain, France, and Belgium. So German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called for the Berlin Conference, and that lasted from the 15th of November, 1884 to the 26th of February, 1885, with roughly 14 countries present. And there was essentially two aims. So the one was to reduce tensions between the European powers, and the second, and equally probably more problematic, was to decide how to carve up the African continent. And this really led to the creation of 54 African countries with irregular borders. And what I mean by that is that these borders were basically constructed outside Africa without the consultation, input, or concern for the diverse groups of African people that would then have to live within these externally imposed boundaries. And so we see the long-term impact of that, in that African countries and economies, by no choosing of their own, were inserted into the global economic order as providers of raw materials to support the development of other countries. And in the long run, this has become what is often referred to as the resource curse. So with the vast majority of the continent's political economy structured around and dependent on exporting primary commodities like raw materials, food, base metals outside of the continent. So in many ways, if we fast forward to today, the scramble for Africa has not really stopped, but continues. And so for the purposes of today's webinar, I think it's important to briefly situate and understand that the recent dash for gas in Africa is linked to broader neo-colonial trends that have already been occurring for some time. So from Senegal to Ethiopia and Mozambique, really right across the continent, foreign investors, both public and private, have been entering into agreements with African governments to control or acquire large tracts of lands. And so these are often, or this phenomenon is often referred to as large-scale land acquisitions, and have become quite widespread over the last 2 decades, particularly following concerns over food security and fossil or fuel supplies, which sounds very familiar and I think really links to the conversation that we are having today. But the critics of these large-scale land acquisitions, particularly in African context, refer to these trends as land grabbing or green grabbing. So just to unpack that a little bit in a little bit more detail, land grabs refers to a change in power and control of ownership over large quantities of land and resources. And this is usually in relation to food security crises, climate change impacts, and also economic drivers. With green grabbing, it involves a similar transfer of and control of use of resources, but it's primarily driven by environmental purposes. For instance, biodiversity conservation, reforestation, or afforestation. But overall, as this quote here implies, the term grab is used specifically because it refers to a loss of access, particularly for poorer and marginalized communities. But these very same academics argue that the term large-scale land acquisition is probably more accurate to use then land grab, because the concept land grab doesn't actually include or refer to the acquisition of land or resources for mining, infrastructure, or fossil fuel projects, as we're seeing at the moment. So just to keep it very simple, and really at its most basic, there are three key motivations driving this phenomenon. So the first is food security, so that we see that the fear of food shortages and increase in food prices, like we have recently or happening at the moment, drives countries that have little arable land to secure their food supplies in other countries, and then import that back into their own countries. The second being energy, so concerns over fuel supplies have been another key driver. And so land is then acquired to produce energy, whether that's from biofuels or more recently in terms of fossil fuel projects. And then last but not least, land has become considered a new source of profit. Thank you. So banks and investors are consider buying up land as a really attractive investment with high returns. So I think, when we're looking at the extent of land grabbing, the first thing to emphasize here is that it is a global phenomenon, but research shows that Africa is most affected here. One of the major challenges in understanding the extent of land grabs is that there is a lack of reliable or consistent data, particularly when it comes to understanding the scale, the geographical distribution, the trends, and the key actors. When it comes to agriculture, so producing food, a 2016 study found that around 26.7 million hectares of land have been appropriated by investors worldwide since 2000. And that's effectively an area as large as the United Kingdom and Slovenia combined. But the continent most affected is still Africa. So of 1,004 agricultural deals, Africa accounted for 422 of those deals. And that amounts to roughly 10 million hectares. So at least almost half of that land that I mentioned previously. And then when it comes to fossil fuels, a recently published bank track report shows that 782 fossil fuel projects between 2016, the year that the Paris Agreement was signed into place, and 2021 are in operation or under construction in West, East, Central, and Southern Africa. And on top of that, another 111 projects have been announced, proposed, or permitted. But really the important point here is that most of those projects are run by companies and are financed by investors with headquarters outside of Africa. So that means the profits are flowing out of the continent and countries who are producing the energy. So I think really just to highlight that land grabbing is primarily a problem and an issue in countries that tend to have poor governance and weak or poor land tenure rights. And so this is the case in many African countries where governments are entering into these deals as a way to balance their budgets, but that this is really at the expense of local communities and their climate commitments. So not to go into too much detail here, because I think Lorraine and Dean will later expand on that in terms of the Don't Gas Africa campaign, but really just some of the socioeconomic impacts is that many of these projects, whether it's for fossil fuel projects, for biofuels, or for food, they often don't follow processes of free, prior, and informed consent. And that leads to the displacement of thousands of people who are evicted off their land, often ancestral land, and has huge consequences in terms of their livelihoods. And then in terms of the climate and environmental impacts, there's a range of them, but these include land use change, the loss of biodiversity, particularly when we consider that Africa is one of the last frontiers of the planet's biodiversity. But then equally also, like we heard earlier, the lock-in of fossil fuels, undermining climate commitments, and a just energy transition in the African context. And so I think really to end off and come to the end of my quick presentation, the difference between the 19th century scramble for Africa and today is that it's far more subtle, and it's often hidden under the guise of development. But today's scramble for Africa is characterized by private sector involvement with the support of local governments, but it's still in the pursuit of natural resources. And so really a key question to leave you all with is, who is development and developmental projects for? If we consider that for the most part, these large-scale land acquisitions or land grabs under the guise of development, whether it's for food or for fuel, do not benefit, but rather exploit local African communities and the continent's resources. I think it really is an indication that we need to work together and really reinforces the importance of conversations like this and creating allies across continents. Thank you so much, and that's the end of my short presentation.
Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing that. And I think you made some really, really good points, especially just to lay the basis for this conversation going forward, particularly that question about development for who. And if development does not serve the people, then is it truly development? So I think let's continue on, and hopefully, and I can definitely tell just from the chat that our discussion later on in the webinar will really be fruitful. So next up, we are going to have Dean. And Dean Bebe is a 2018 Mandela Rhodes Scholar and a climate justice activist with several years of experience in building and implementing campaign strategies that advance the idea that African economies need to urgently shift away from the dependence on fossil fuel-based energy generation and leapfrog to renewable energy. Dean is currently the campaign's lead for Power Shift Africa and has been heavily involved in the Don't Gas Africa campaign, which we will hear more about from him as well as Lorraine. So Dean, over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and hello, everyone. Yeah, so we are here and we're really discussing gas, which is really one of the most important challenges we're facing as the emerging green global economy. And we're at this fix, right, where we have the Don't Gas Africa campaign, which was fundamentally came out as a response to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, but also how now gas is currently being framed as something that is green and something that is clean and something that can really be grounded on Africa's energy future. However, I mean, on that backdrop, there was an African Union committee that was drafted with energy and transport ministers and was made up of that. And they drafted this common position on energy access and transition for adoption at COP27. And looking at this document, we did note, as the Don't Gas Africa campaign, that it was quite problematic because there were major issues with that current draft that required an urgent response. Because if adopted, Africa would risk presenting a common position at COP27 that barely mentions renewable energy or decentralized energy access, but instead will represent the interests of the fossil fuel industry by explicitly stating gas, oil, and coal will continue to play a crucial role in the continent's energy mix. And this, as mentioned, comes at a time when a significant number of wealthy European countries are pivoting away from fossil fuels, driving Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine to scramble for access to Africa's energy resources. And that being said, as the previous speaker mentioned and alluded to briefly, that Africa cannot afford the risks associated with the investment in gas, creating stranded assets and getting locked in infrastructure formats which are grounded on exploitation. And we really then took that opportunity and we wrote to the Africa Group of Negotiators around an emergency meeting that was held in Ethiopia to try and tackle that. And that idea was quashed, but that really then pivoted us to get to a point where we really realized that there was a need for a campaign that's really grounded on trying to tackle the gas issue. And we did then, you know, move ahead and launch the Don't Gas Africa campaign. And we partnered with Global Citizen, you know, for example. And so far we've got 6,896 signatures across the continent, where we are telling African leaders that we do not want them to gas Africa. And which was really one of the most turning points for the campaigners as a whole, because we believe that that is when it really heightened itself for it to be recognized globally. On that backdrop as well, it became so highly prioritized, the issue around gas in Africa and how Africans deserved a voice, that we also then got invited by Global Citizen on stage in Ghana during the Global Citizen Festival, where we addressed hundreds of thousands of people around how the issue around gas and how Africans are saying no to gas. In as much as this is political satire, right, it does really try and capture, you know, the pettiness that currently exists within the international structure. And at the same time, that is also given an opportunity for a significant number of international teams to come and stand in solidarity with different African comrades and movements to stand and to say no to gas. But at the same time, we also have an international working group that have really structured a really wonderful international solidarity letter that speaks around the Don't Gas Africa campaign. But it is really grounded on the fact that the campaign has got two sides to it. And one major key component of it is Africans are saying no. And we want Africans to stand and provide that African narrative and that they're leading that narrative. But on the second side as well, we've got the international side. And we do not want it to be a notion where the international structures are really telling African leaders what to do, because that might not be potentially be received well. So that international solidarity stands as a way to pressure European governments and European structures to try and adopt a much more climate ambitious plan that will not really lock Africa in a fossil fuel stranded future. And you might ask, you know, how is this relevant? Because the dash for gas in Africa is an issue based on equality, because any conversation about the climate crisis in Africa is incomplete without considering how it disproportionately harms disadvantaged communities in Africa who are at least responsible for the climate crisis. The dash for gas is a political issue because gas expansion in Africa lacks pushing for fostering local ownership and democratic control, and it risks making Africa's energy system more subject to foreign ownership and influence. The dash for gas for Africa is a biodiversity issue because fossil fuels are the main drivers of climate change, and climate change is becoming the largest driver of biodiversity loss worldwide. The dash for gas in Africa is a gender issue, as we see very few women are being represented in the current energy sector that is grounded on extractivism, that is currently governed by fossil fuels. And the growing threat to use Africa as a gas station has made it clear for Africa to raise its climate ambitions on the international agenda and Africa's ability to be a green, clean global economy and not just a victim of the climate crisis. That being said, recently the European Parliament has just called for nation states to work on developing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty and resolution passed ahead of COP27, which again was a win for the campaign because fundamentally the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty does allude to having a pillar grounding it on renewable energy. So this is just to note that we do stand in solidarity with our partners in the international team who are also pushing on their end, seeing as the main victims who are seeking to extract gas from Africa are actually Europeans, particularly the G7 or the G20, how you want to translate it. Moving ahead, while that was also happening, there was recently the Africa Energy Week that was held in Cape Town. I think it was last week. And this was really one of the breaking news that came out of the meeting where, you know, Europeans were really using that opportunity during Africa Energy Week to sneak fossil fuels into the COP27 agenda. And the gathering really was also grounded on trying to then planning on a new push for scaling up fossil fuels for geopolitical leverage and initiate a new era of discoveries that really have to be expanded into Africa's least explored frontiers, and as a result, try to increase their profits and also develop enhanced oil recovery techniques, and really fundamentally to redraw Africa's oil, gas, and energy map through new pipelines to change the laws and regulations to achieve these goals. So that was on the main agenda at the Africa Energy Week. And we were joined by comrades across South Africa to really be there every day, trying to push and really do a push for the good fight to pursue that. This Africa Energy Week rather is a resemblance of Africa's Death Week, because we are really there to really discuss how to further exploit and further put Africa in a precarious position. And that meeting alone was also attended by senior European and officials and corporations. And it was a very important stepping stone in Europe's wider effort to pivot for Africa's fossil fuels and to capture Africa's energy supply for its own use. So largely, this was to also build on the fact that we want to really end energy appetite, because we were calling for an end to fossil fuel induced energy appetite in Africa, which has left 600 million people, without energy access. And we wanted to use this movement to join movements across Africa in demanding an end to fossil gas and other dirty energies that are obsolete and inappropriate for Africa's energy systems. And we wanted to bring about a people energy revolution, where we were calling for a transformative people-led process involving rapid social, economic, and political change to achieving energy democracy and deliver renewable energy assets into the hands of the people and communities across the continent. And we really got great images, and there was quite a number of activities done there. And we were screaming, literally, no more oil, no more gas. And it was such an impactful time, such that even the delegates themselves did come out and try and offer the people that were protesting, some beverage, some food. And they were literally standing there for an hour trying to beg people to actually eat food. And it was also a great moment to say, listen, we are not going to, number one, eat. And at the same time, why would we also eat at the table of things that have been purchased with dirty money? So it was really, really something that was really great and very impactful, where we were even as a next stepping stone, we'll be launching a policy briefing rather ahead of COP27, not really particular about when the launch date would be, but it really captures the social, economic, and the physical challenges of the gas problem in Africa, and also grounding it on trying to capture the data that already exists from Banktrack, from Global Energy Monitor, and how we can use that to try and map out which areas potentially can be a threat as a result of these new explorations of gas in Africa if adopted. So it does capture the number of people who are potentially at threat in those areas and those hotspots that might suffer biodiversity loss as a result of this. So please do watch out for that fundamental report. I think it's very important and really amazing. And then, last and something quite important to mention, that we're also joining people offline, at COP27 who won't be able to attend, to really do some great actions like launching social media toolkits that are really going to be very impactful. But also at COP, we will be planning some in-person actions, and also building on, for example, cartoon illustrations that border on political satire, and also grounding it on actions at COP to also try and tackle the problem, particularly during Energy Day. But just as a reminder that, it is urged to continue the good fight, even today, even tomorrow, before COP, because already deals are being signed as we speak. In DRC, over 36 concessions have been signed for new gas explorations. So in as much as we are targeting 15 November as an action day, for the Don't Gas Africa campaign, it's very important to note that the fight starts now, because fundamentally a lot of deals are being signed without consultation from civil society, without consultation from the people who are actually on the ground. So fundamentally, what we need to take from this is that, gas is not clean, gas is not green. And at the same time, it is time for us Africans to take ownership of that and lead and decide our future on our terms that are grounded and governed by African values, principles, and standing. Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you so much, Dean, for that input. And I think it's really important, for that reminder that gas is not green and gas is not clean. And also the importance of an African-led campaign. And as much as this is an intercontinental exchange, I think, Dean, just that affirmation that in Africa we need to take back our power and make sure that this campaign is led by us. So thank you for that. We are now going to hear from Lorraine. And Lorraine has been in the climate justice space for nearly a decade, having engaged as an activist, a community rights defender, a regional climate and energy facilitator, and she now embarks on a new role under the Africa Climate Movement of Movements as the Africa Coordinator. Lorraine is also one of 3 African facilitators of the Don't Gas Africa campaign. Previously, Lorraine worked as the coordinator of the Africa Coal Network, where she organized and supported efforts to disrupt the fossil fuel system in Africa to ensure a just transition and divestment from coal in a just, democratic, and regenerative manner. Lorraine holds a Master of Science degree in Development Studies from Women's University in Africa, with the Del Campo and Best Student Award under her achievements, and a Social Science degree majoring in Psychology from the University of Zimbabwe. Lorraine, I know that you are having some network issues, so I am going to share Lorraine's presentation, and she will hopefully join us just through audio. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Courtney, and thanks to Africa Climate Reality Project for inviting us to this amazing space. I think it is very much due having this intercontinental process going on, especially around fossil fuels extraction in Africa. So on the first screen, you're seeing my title and also the website for Don't Gas Africa. As was mentioned, I'm now with the Africa Climate Movement of Movements, and I'm also still a facilitator for the Don't Gas Africa campaign. Next slide. So for this slide, I'm going to just give an overview of a research that was done by the Africa Climate Foundation. So this publication came very much timely because it highlighted that Africa holds 40% of all new gas discoveries. And so I wanted to highlight and to let everyone know that Africa already has reserves for gas and has had an appetite for gas, but the only challenge was that there hadn't been any funding or financing for massive gas projects. Of course, as you see in my presentation, that there are some countries which have got economies that are hinged or that are held by gas, but because of this new rush and crisis, global energy crisis happening, it has actually fed into increase of gas in Africa. So of course, I won't repeat what was mentioned about the Russia-Ukraine war and the scramble for access to African energy resources. Next slide. So this is the publication that was done this year. Like I said, it came timely. It shows some of the statistics and also the information on the dash for gas in Africa. And I would encourage everyone to just go through it. I'll share a link in chat later. Next slide. Yeah, so for my presentation, I'm going to give a background and overview of what led us to coming up with the Don't Gas Africa campaign. Like I mentioned earlier on, that Africa has always had gas resources, but there has been a major serious lack of funds and support to invest in massive gas projects. But as soon as the global crisis occurred, and as soon as there was that pivoting by Europe declaring that gas is perhaps a renewable energy or a transition fuel, also African leaders then decided to use that opportunity to come up with an African Union position, an African common position on energy access and just energy transition. So it is this position paper that shocked everyone, all civil society groups, that how can Africa now come with this position that puts forward gas as a transition fuel and is very necessary in the continent. As you can see, this is a clip that was taken from the internet and the release by the African Union that on July 22nd, 2022 on gas in Africa. Next slide. Okay, so just in brief, the African Union position paper, it called for expanding of coal, oil, gas, and even nuclear, by the way, saying that these fossil fuels are very crucial in the future of Africa. And this was said without any scientific evidence, without any consideration of the threat that would happen to our biodiversity, to our health, to the climate impact. And again, the position paper, rather than representing the hundreds of millions of African people that access to energy, we felt that it represented the interest of fossil fuel industry and richer nations that had been coming to Africa to push and advance a gas agenda. Next slide. Okay, so like I mentioned, that this is similar to the recent push by the EU, and also just trying to frame gas as a clean energy. So this is all despite that just last year, before the year ended and during the COP26, various nations came up saying that they will no longer be financing fossil fuels, they will no longer be financing overseas investment in coal. So this again came as a big surprise when we saw that the EU was now focusing on expanding of gas. Despite the global energy crisis, we felt that pivoting to gas is not the solution, and richer countries should have pivoted towards renewable energy. Next slide. Okay, so in response to the African Union position paper, various civil society organizations came together urgently and came up with a letter that they drafted, which was targeting the African Union. So this paper was an agent called by Africa Civil Society to urge the African Union not to support the expansion of fossil fuels on the continent. And just to highlight that the African Union's intent was to actually make this COP27 a gas COP, whereby they were advocating for financing of gas projects in Africa. And as was mentioned earlier on, that investment in gas was not aimed at meeting the needs of 600 million people in Africa, but this position on gas was meant to extract gas from Africa, create pipelines that displace communities, that devastate the environment, and actually feed into the market in Europe. So this has nothing to do with African people, their energy needs, and Africa's development. As we can all see that this position by Europe does not consider, there hasn't been any consideration of Africa's energy poverty. And it shows that Africa's energy poverty has been very much normalized, whereby plans are made, massive plans are made, not to meet the needs of African people, but to meet the consumption and opulence of countries in Europe. Next slide. So fortunately enough, as the Africa climate negotiators quashed the proposal by the African Union to promote gas as a bridging fuel during this COP27. So as I mentioned earlier on, that the group of the African Union that came up with this position was a group of Africa energy ministers, Africa's transport ministers. This excluded Africa climate negotiators that are in the African Union. So they wanted the Africa climate negotiators to put forward this position on gas. And so the Africa climate negotiators refused to present this during this year's UN talks on climate. So for us, that was a small win, if I should say, that at least we have got climate negotiators that are not advancing a fossil fuel as part of a transition fuel for Africa and as part of an African agenda. But however, this does not mean that African leaders and African governments are not advancing an agenda on fossil fuel, and that they will not do that during this COP. Next slide. Okay, so just to highlight some of the engagements that has been done just in this year. So this year we saw Italy coming into Africa, signing deals, more than 12 deals. There's also this notorious energy company, again called Eni. I know that it is a massive company that has got more than 50-something energy projects globally. So we saw these countries, these corporates coming to Africa, signing deals with African countries, doing their scoping of the continent, just as was mentioned earlier on the scramble and partition for Africa. They are busy scoping for deals, signing for deals, and I guarantee everyone that these deals are not championing African people and will not contribute anything towards the lives of African people. So some of the companies that already have got gas projects, such as Total Energies, ExxonMobil in Mozambique, we've got German and Turkey, Turkey's in South Africa. All of these energy companies are coming to Africa to extract gas. And again, just to highlight that the agenda to fuel to gas Africa is not dead yet. We still have got a long way in fighting this. I think Dean mentioned the Africa Energy Week, whereby we saw the fossil fuel industry come to Cape Town. We saw Africa's energy ministers. We saw global governments, African governments coming to Africa to chart the path on gas. Next slide. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier on, that these are some of the countries that were represented during the Africa Energy Week. I think it happened about last week or maybe a week and a half ago. So these are some of the countries that were present. Like I mentioned, there are some producers in Africa that are already strong producers of gas. These include Algeria, Angola, Nigeria, Egypt, and Equatorial Guinea. And then we've got countries that are emerging that are actually actively developing gas in Africa, which include Mozambique, Tanzania, Mauritania, Senegal, and Ethiopia. We've got also countries that are exploring gas, such as South Africa and Namibia. So all these countries were present in the Africa Energy Week, advancing a gas energy. So if you look at the next slide, you see a snippet of the agenda. So here, if you look at this agenda, it again testifies to the position that is being taken by our own African leaders, citing that this scenario, the COP27 scenario, is a very much different scenario. And this COP27, we're going to be seeing oil, gas, and nuclear taking up the agenda. So again, as civil society groups and also community groups, we are going to be fighting this gassing of Africa and this agenda, because this position, if it is taken forward, it means that we are again going to, it is going to result again in plunder of African resources and displacements and all those other impacts. Also, just, I would like to mention the recent floods in Nigeria, that despite the floods that we've seen throughout this year, there were floods in Durban this year earlier on during Easter, and now we've got floods in Nigeria. Still, there isn't any consideration of climate impact. These corporates and also even our energy ministers have been allowed to push forward an agenda that has actually resulted in massive deaths, massive displacement of people, and putting Africa in a position where our food security is compromised, our livelihoods are compromised as a result of the climate disasters. Next slide. This was again mentioned by Dean during the Africa's Energy Week. So next slide. So I wanted again just to mention some of the threats that are presented by this agenda. Like as was mentioned by the IPCC report this year, that investing in gas is going to result in stranded assets. And for Africa, we feel that this will happen because what Africa is trying to do at this point is to try and remedy a short-term crisis in Europe by investing long-term in African infrastructure, just to remedy a sort solution. As soon as that, challenge, the energy crisis is remedied, it means Africa's infrastructure and all those impacts that would have happened is that because of that short-term investment are going to leave Africa's assets stranded. And again, the African Union position does not mention scaling up of renewable energy. So which means that that position paper is taking away finances, resources, and efforts towards scaling up of clean energy, and it is redirecting that towards fossil fuels. And like I mentioned, investing in fossil fuels is going to weaken the resilience of Africa's energy system, and also it means that people's energy systems will not be met. As we all know that fossil fuels, especially gas, oil, those require massive projects that cannot be decentralized to communities in their districts because of the nature and how they are. So it means that having fossil fuels in Africa means that the already vulnerable populations who don't have energy will not have access to energy because it cannot be deployed in their different regions. Next. And also issues to do with health. As you all know, the massive pollution that is caused by, fossil fuel extraction. This is another fear, that communities that host these projects have so much normalized air pollution. They've very much normalized breathing in dirty air, having their water resources polluted. And so this again compromise our health, especially given the system, the extent to which our health systems in Africa are not up to par. And again, I mentioned earlier that investing in gas is going to damage Africa's ecosystems. It will affect our biodiversity. As we all know that the world's biodiversity is held by indigenous communities. And in Africa, we still have a number of indigenous communities that have managed to preserve their biodiversity. And so all this will be lost as a result of the climate change that will come because of burning and intensifying the burning of gas. Next. And again, burning of gas is going to increase the vulnerability of African people. I will again mention what we're facing now, the floods in Nigeria, whereby 31, I think out of 36 states in Nigeria are consumed by floods, or at least affected by floods. And a number of these states have got people that at this moment have actually left their homes because of their floods, staying in shelters. And I think about 600 people have died as a result of these floods happening in Nigeria. So again, investing in gas is going to result in global warming, which, as we have seen, is causing all these climate disasters that we have faced in Africa. And again, I won't leave out the issue of human rights violation, whereby massive gas investment will certainly result in forced evictions, land grabbing, and grabbing of communities' commons, such as grazing land, recreational areas. So again, investment in gas is not for Africa. And again, I wanted to mention the issue of trying to advance the economy. I know a number of our African leaders are saying that Africa needs to be given an opportunity to invest in fossil fuels as the mechanism for growth. However, this is again a false solution, whereby our planetary system, our economic system is going to be sorry for that. So again, like I was saying just now, to fight with the economic system. And again, it means we are on the losing side because definitely given the climate disasters, there's no human that will be able to withstand the reaction of our planet if we continue on this path of climate disasters and so forth. So again, I want us to continue in the fight against the dash for gas in Africa, and to challenge governments in Europe to invest in renewable energies instead of dashing for gas and increasing fossil fuel extraction in Africa. Thank you very much, and apologies for my laptop and my network. Back to you, Courtney.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. That was a really insightful presentation, and thank you for giving us the necessary updates on the campaign as well. It's good to know the activism that is happening on the ground. So thank you for that, but also the background that we really needed to understand why this campaign is so important. We are going to move forward with the last panelist. We are moving quite fast, which is great because then that gives us a lot more time for the Q&A. So I'm going to hand over to Esther. Sorry, let me just find myself. Yeah, I'm going to hand over to Esther, who works on EU gas policy and covers energy infrastructure, trans-European energy networks, sector integration, methane, and amongst other topics. With more than 15 years experience on EU climate and energy policies from very different perspectives, including NGOs, institutions, which was the Ministry of Environment and the European Parliament, and with a Brussels-based energy cooperative, she's able to take a bird's eye view on EU energy transition policies. She holds a master's degree in environmental science. And for this presentation, we are really going to hear more from the European perspective on how how we can look at policy, but also understand it from both perspectives, that we can strengthen our solidarity from both sides. So Esther, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thanks a lot, Courtney, for this introduction, and thanks a lot to all the other speakers who've been telling us a lot of interesting things. So I'll just share my screen here in a second. We should have it. Okay. Can you see this? Okay.
Yes, we can.
So this is full screen, yeah? Okay. Good. So yes, thanks a lot for having me here today. I'm doing the gas policy coordination at CAN Europe. So we are a node of CAN International. We do represent more than 45 million people across the EU. We have more than 180 member organizations, networks, and individual organizations. Yes, so we do represent quite a large part of the European civil society. Yes, so this is a fascinating topic, I must say, and so many things have already been said. I heard, I think, Dean or Lorraine mentioning GEM, the Global Energy Monitor. I found this map, which I found quite interesting, and I thought it would be nice to start with this one, just to give a bit of an idea of what we have already in terms of extraction going on the African continent, and what is being still planned, what is being operated, what is being constructed, and what is being planned. And we do see, so the countries that you mentioned, Lorraine, just a couple of minutes ago, yeah, obviously they match quite well with what we can see here on this map. So we've got historical sort of exploration, gas extraction going on in Algeria, well connected to the EU, up to Spain. There is some existing LNG terminals there, there's some existing pipes there. Then we've got here across the almost entire west coast, along Senegal, Nigeria, down to Angola, loads of construction plans here for pipes and LNG terminals, which are the small yellow spots. And then we've got all proposed, I mean, less advanced pipelines going up here from South Africa up to Mozambique, Tanzania, with some LNG terminals proposed as well. And then quite a well-developed spot here also around Egypt, or in Egypt, with already operating LNG terminals and pipelines being also being already built. So there is indeed also some new exploration going on, and it matches quite well with plans, with European plans. I'll move on to the next slide, which is here. I wanted to come back also just to briefly sort of remind what has been previously agreed at COP26 last year. There was an international statement to get out of unabated fossil fuels. So it was a joint statement saying that foreign fossil fuel support and international fossil fuel support for unabated fossil fuels should end by the end of 2022. This statement has been signed by Germany, France, Denmark, Spain, for instance, but also the US and Canada. And we see that, so that was in November 21. A couple of months earlier, in May 21, we had the IEA, so the International Energy Agency, coming out with a net zero report, which was also saying we cannot afford to go into new oil or gas fields, so extraction activities, and we should also not fund new infrastructure, gas and fossil fuel, but specifically also new gas infrastructure to avoid gas lock-in effect. Because so the Paris Agreement says we want to limit temperature increase by 1.5 degrees. And this implies for us, so Can Europe says that we need to come to climate neutrality by 2040, and that we need to phase out gas by 2035, for instance. Voilà. This is echoed here by a set of, let's say, international institutions, statements, and so on. And then, well, what happened? You all know it. It has been mentioned already several times. The war, the Russian aggression on the Ukraine, and then a very frenetic sort of diversification strategy launched by the EU with the objective to get away from Russian gas and to very quickly and rapidly get away from Russian gas by the end of this year, reducing Russian imports to the EU, which are equivalent to 155 BCM of gas per year, which is almost half, a bit less, like maybe a third, a big third of total EU. Of total EU gas imports. And so this Russian aggression has then put the Commission on highest level into a very steep action modus with plans to which are called REPowerEU, known as REPowerEU. In May last year, the Commission came out with that proposal, which is looking at like how the EU is going to diversify its away from Russian gas, and that is then through a dash for other gas in other parts of the world, not only in Africa, also the US, also in Qatar, also in Azerbaijan, but a lot in Africa as well. It's also REPowerEU is also looking at how to boost and how to amplify development of renewables and energy efficiency, energy savings. But it certainly has also this diversification and gas diversification element. So the slide that I'm showing you here now is actually, it's slightly before that REPowerEU plan, but it was already, it was already in the making. And the Commission got the demand, the request from member states to put together or to build up an EU energy purchase platform and an EU energy task force. And here we've got some quotes from Frans Timmermans, which is the Executive Vice President for the European Green Deal. So #1 in the European Commission behind President von der Leyen, stating that this EU energy purchase platform is now functioning to work together on purchasing gas from other suppliers and developing an international market for hydrogen. So it's about gas and about hydrogen a lot. The Commissioner for Energy, Catherine Simpson, says, so to succeed in this task, the EU must use its collective political and market power on global markets to be able to purchase as collectively as the EU sufficient volumes of gaseous fuels, of fossil gas, of hydrogen from other countries. We go to the next slide here. This is the task force that I already mentioned, which is looking at that purchasing and identifying maybe more specifically where that purchasing can happen. And here we've got an interesting map which shows, it's a world map, and it shows the different regions. I mentioned the US, I mentioned also the Azerbaijan and in eastern region rather. But here we've got the African continent, and we can see that there is clearly a focus on an energy dialogue with Algeria. There is a focus on Egypt and Israel to increase LNG supplies. And there is a focus on the sub-Saharan African countries such as Senegal, Nigeria, and Angola. And this we can see in some official, this sort of reflects in some official documents that we see that they are in the making, that we know that they are in the making. for discussion at the fringes of the COP. I mean, it's not part of the official negotiations, as you know, but it's rather, let's say, on using the COP as a platform to go into some more formal partnerships and relationships around gas or hydrogen with specific countries. So the first one here is a memorandum of understanding, a strategic partnership between the EU and Egypt, the host country. Egypt, which has already quite a strongly developed gas infrastructure. And in this case, it's a strategic partnership on renewable hydrogen. That's the scope of the EU. I mean, that's what the EU wants, apparently. But in the discussions, I think it is not yet entirely clear-cut how much. I mean, if the different parties are really sort of agreeing on hydrogen, green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, so being hydrogen produced from fossil gas. Voilà, so it's about hydrogen and its derivatives such as ammonia, methanol, synthetic gases and synthetic fuels, and it is supposed to contribute to the decarbonization and security of supply, of energy supply, as part of the European strategy of diversification of energy sources and suppliers. So this MOU is supposed to be adopted during the second part of the week. We've got a second example of another MOU with Namibia, between the EU and Namibia, about green hydrogen as well. So green hydrogen being hydrogen produced from renewable electricity through electrolysis. And this MOU is looking at renewable hydrogen, but also a sustainable raw materials value chain. Similarly, again, the objective here is to promote new channels for investment and trade in cooperation with Namibia and the EU. A non-binding MOU planned to be signed by the Commission President von der Leyen on behalf of the Union in the margins of the COP27. So highest level being there and going and representing the EU for those partnerships. What else do we have on the plate? We see that there's been some spectacular U-turns from what I've seen, what I've showed you in the beginning of my presentation. So that that international statement to end international financial support for gas or fossil extraction, the Glasgow statement, which was signed by Germany, for instance. Well, in the recent past, shortly after, before summer, Italian government officials as well as German government officials went to several African countries to go into discussions around how to sort of increase cooperation, increase extraction. In the case of Germany, so the Chancellor Olaf Scholz went to Senegal and is looking into how or negotiating around how to increase capacity for LNG and increasing exports of LNG, so liquid gas from that country. Forecasts are reaching 2.5 million tons next year already, and 10 million tons by 2030. It includes technical investments in necessary power plant infrastructure, so it's quite a significant discussion going on here. Italy going to Angola, looking into new natural gas ventures, new exploration fields. So these are part of the emerging. Oh no, it's not one of the emerging countries. It's already producing countries. So yeah. Voilà, so that's for individual initiatives from member states, but we've got also Commissioner catalysing, Energy Commissioner again, who not very long ago, early October, visited the Algerian energy minister. So that's really one of the almost sort of neighboring country to the EU neighborhood, very close to EU neighborhood, and having discussions and talks with the government there to look into increasing the volumes of Algerian gas potentially available for the European market. and yeah, looking into tapping into new gas fields. So Algeria is already one of the main suppliers of EU gas consumption and gas demand, of EU gas demand. And it's also here being sort of mobilized to increase exports to the EU. So these are some, we heard also, I mean, there's companies, also private companies looking at extraction sites, specific projects. We heard mentioned BP, Shell, Total, Eni. I mean, they're all around, and they're all looking for additional supplies here. Obviously, that is very problematic from our point of view. So we are, as I said, we are looking at climate neutrality by 2040. We are looking at the gas phase out by 2035, and it's very, very problematic to have new extraction sites in this period now, and also going and looking for new infrastructure or developing new infrastructure, be it piped infrastructure or LNG infrastructure. It is problematic for the EU, but it's obviously also problematic for you, because it's not giving you, I mean, we heard it, it was very well explained by the previous speakers, because it doesn't give you the clean energy transition, or it doesn't put you on a clean energy transition path, as you would need also to be. So from the EU perspective, we have a very strong demand on not investing any public money into new infrastructure, extraction or transport. This is going to create stranded assets, because these infrastructures are, I mean, it's long-term infrastructure. It's going to be there for 30, 40 years and more. And by then we need to be already long in climate neutrality. I mean, we cannot afford to emit any greenhouse gases anymore by then. So it's obviously going to be an infrastructure which is not going to be used at its full extent. It's obviously money which is not going to be invested in the real solutions, in the alternatives, in cutting energy demand, in boosting renewable energies, and yeah, it's putting us on the wrong path. We are completely here in this. We are in this difficult situation here of the war, very quick sort of replacement of one fossil fuel source through others, and that obviously opening up the route for loads of new sort of extraction sites, transportation routes, infrastructure, and so on. So that's very problematic. We also, I mean, we also heard previously that gas it's not a clean fuel, and the gas industry has made a very good job of many decades to sell itself as being natural gas, clean gas, much more healthy, much less CO2 heavy as, for instance, coal. But that doesn't take into account the whole upstream emissions or the emissions across the entire supply chain, which include obviously also methane emissions and methane leaks from extraction to production, and then transmission, transport, and then the final end use. So it is a very gas remains a very fossil fuel, and a very powerful fossil fuel, with this methane being associated, which is a much stronger greenhouse gas as CO2. CO2 is released when the gas is burned, but then the methane leakages gas is by 94-95% methane, and the leakages are happening across the entire supply chain. And methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than fossil gas, up to over a short time period, over 20 years, up to 80 times or 86 times more. So what else do we say? So renewable, we've seen those MOUs with Egypt and Namibia for renewable hydrogen. So that's one of the EU's and the Commission's sort of big objectives. The Commission is on a complete hydrogen hype. They want to have hydrogen everywhere, in every sectors, whereas we know that that's a complete nonsense. I mean, they want to build up a hydrogen market, and there is many different sectors which want to see the hydrogen also in their end users. We know that hydrogen is a very scarce resource. I mean, we don't have it yet so much. I mean, it's being used mainly in the fertilizer industry, and it's being produced mainly from fossil gas, but we will only be able to use hydrogen in some very specific sectors, in industry, energy intensive industry sectors, and in transport sectors. So we really have a very strong objective of keeping that hydrogen use to those priority sectors only, and we think that we should predominantly produce that hydrogen in the EU and leave your resources mostly to you guys, to the people in Africa and the African governments, to also embark on an energy transition. I mean, at least that needing to happen first before you would supply you would maybe supply developed countries with the resources that you have on your continents. So if we see only, I mean, the vast majority of the hydrogen needs to be produced in the EU. If there is production happening outside the EU and some exports happening, then that needs to happen only if the country has full energy access, has embarked on the energy transition. That additionality is guaranteed. Additionality is very important because hydrogen is coming on top. We need to go towards an electrification of our energy systems. Transport needs to be electrified. I mean, the modal shift needs to happen, but then the transport needs also to go into electrification. Heating homes, in keeping homes warm in Europe needs to happen via electrification and renewable electricity. So all of this is going to use a lot of electricity. And if we want to produce renewable hydrogen, we need to have additional renewable electricity to produce that hydrogen. So that's where this additionality sort of principle comes from, and it's a very important one. It needs to be guaranteed that there's additional renewable generation capacities that are going to be installed to produce that renewable hydrogen. And on top of that, was additional robust sustainable criteria such as water use need to be also respected. Voilà, this is what I wanted to tell you, or sort of the insights that I wanted to give you on the EU side of things. I'm happy to take your questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Esther, for that extensive background as well from the European perspective. I think it's very important that we understand both of those perspectives. So we have come to the end of our panel. So I just want to firstly say a huge thank you to our panelists, to Esther, Lorraine, Dean, and Amy, as well as Jolt for giving us their inputs. I think it was really necessary, and as everyone has been saying, in the lead up to COP27, the gas issue is going to be possibly a huge issue. So I think let's go into our discussion. We have about 30 minutes for either Q&A, so a question to a particular panelist, or just a question to the group. We're trying to not let it be too formal. So yeah, if you have a question, please either leave it in the chat or raise your hand and you can unmute and ask your question. I don't see any hands, and I'm just going to also ask the team to alert me if I am missing any hands. So, but I'm going to start with a question from the chat, and I think that was from Richard Worthington asking, while saying that there was so much hypocrisy, particularly from Germany, saying that in Europe, fossil fuel, the return to more fossil fuel is supposedly the short-term strategic response just to the Russia war, yet in Africa, Europe is enabling this long-term and a big gas expansion. So I'm assuming to Esther, are there any plans to remind these countries which were listed in your slide of the COP26 commitments, perhaps at COP27 opening, or yeah, maybe just tell us a bit more about what the plans are to hold these countries accountable?
So yes, thanks for that question. Yes, so we are carefully monitoring what the developments are. I mean, so for the time being, we've got this these official MOUs that I showed to you, the first two not slides, but the first two sort of MOUs between Egypt and Namibia for the initiative, sort of the outreaches, the individual member states outreaches, Algeria, Germany going to Senegal, Italy going to Angola. I'm not sure to what extent that is going to be a topic at the COP itself. I mean, which doesn't prevent us from being able to comment on it. But for the time being, we're screening that, and we are preparing ourselves to be ready for reactions. I'm looking at it really from the European perspective. I'm not in, for instance, maybe the discussions on or more close to the Don't Gas Africa campaign, where there might be also some European representatives discussing those things. So I'm not sure if there's concrete actions being planned. For sure, I mean, we want to be ready to, if any of those announcements are being made more publicly, to be able to react, for instance, with a fossil of a day or something like that. So I think that's clearly something which we have on our radar.
Okay, thank you, Esther. Are there any questions of clarification or just perspectives from? I've seen we have quite a vast array of different countries that are represented in this webinar, which is really, really amazing. Sandy Field, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to thank all the speakers for their really enlightening talks today. I want to just tell you, I'm in Pennsylvania in the United States, and we are seeing exactly the same thing that you're seeing. We're seeing this build out of fracked gas as a bridge to the renewable energy future. We're seeing false solutions. Every single way that they can use fracked gas, they are trying to use it. They're using it to make power. They're using it to make plastic. They're using it to make Bitcoin. Every single thing. They're also, my government has put a bunch of money into hydrogen hubs in our area. We're trying to get one, apparently. Carbon capture and storage is another one of their false solutions. And we just feel as though this is their last push, because they know that their industry is going away. And so the war is just another excuse for them to try and push these industries. And we're just fighting every single one of these things as they come up. And we're in solidarity with your efforts in Africa. We really understand what you're going through, and I'm glad to hear that there are people there who are really working so hard. It's really very, it makes me feel really good to know that there's other folks working on this stuff, because it's very difficult to fight against this powerful industry with their messaging.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Yeah, and I think it's good to have more perspectives in the room around, especially from areas where gas has been used for quite a while, and just to see probably the trajectory that a lot of European countries are going towards. So thank you for that. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to ask a clarifying question, raise your hand, and chat to some of our panelists. I'm going to give it a minute, and hopefully people want to, but otherwise there we go. Richard?
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, I agree with everything that was said in the previous presentation about hydrogen, the cautions, etc. But I just given that we're facing a lot of natural gas being punted as opportunities to attract investment, I think we just need to be a little careful not to be too down on green hydrogen. It does make sense to produce green hydrogen where the best renewable resources are. We've got a lot of those in Africa. So, you know, I've seen a couple of statements which seem to be completely dismissive of hydrogen. I'd just like to caution a little against that, because for some of us, it seems like a better option when it comes to seeking to mobilize investment than the current stuff, which is getting greater currency, which is the natural gas stuff. So it does seem to me that there is a positive role, potential positive role for green hydrogen production in Africa. It's longer term than the gas stuff, but on the other hand, it takes a long time to develop. So when it comes to leaders that are anxiously punting for investment, that, well, it's treated as a question. Do you think it makes sense to keep that as one of the options so that we don't rule out entirely as a way of attracting investment that includes some production for export, as long as that is not, you know, the sole raison d'etre for it? So yeah, make it a question. Thanks.
Okay, maybe we go to another question, and I see Sandy has also responded in the chat around the green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen discussion, which I think is a very important one as well. The next hand I see is Imua Bonuvi. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm speaking from Nigeria, the Niger Delta. I just wanted to find out if it's going to be business as usual with the oil companies, because the Niger Delta actually is a gas deposit area. The oil is not as much as the gas. And we know for 52 years now, gas is being burnt every day, 24/7 every year. And it has contributed, as we are all aware, to the climate change. You can imagine the whole of the Niger Delta with gas pipes burning in the air, because you can't extract oil without the gas. And if there is now a liquefied natural gas company, which I'm sure buyers will now be looking into as an alternative to Russia and Ukraine oil, energy supplies. And I'm wondering, Shell seems to have moved out because they have destroyed the Niger Delta, the environment, the people. We can't fish, we can't do much. I'm sure people are aware of that. And now we are suffering from floods. A lot of people, I'm sure you've heard about it, people have been displaced because of the flood. Most of them are sleeping in primary schools and so on and so forth. Is it going to be, my question is it going to be business as usual? Because the government, every thing that has been put in place to make sure that the Niger Delta is cleaned and most of the environment restored, it's not going on. But the government keep telling people it's going on. Nothing is going on. And I'm just asking, are we now destined more for more pollution, more environmental degradation, more of that? Because once people get into the government and they want them to help to restore, it's like a black hole. Everything just gets absorbed and nothing is done in actually where the problem is. I know it's not a question that anybody here can answer, but we are really in trouble. We are in trouble. I don't know how far how this can be taken up, and the people on ground should be dealt with instead of the government. We also are aware of the huge corruption issues that are in Nigeria. That's why I said anything that is given to the government to do something about Niger Delta is swallowed up in corruption and in ineptitude and all kinds of things. So what do we do? Well, how do we go from here? We are meant to die in silence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that question, but really for that input on the importance of the Niger Delta and the on-the-ground experiences of people, which is unfortunately quite a common experience of people in Africa who feel like there's nothing left to do and that we are just going to be left behind, and that the rest of the world is able to just move on business as usual, while Africa continues to suffer the brunt of the climate crisis, including the recent floods in Nigeria. We see massive flooding in Mozambique quite often, as well as the recent floods in South Africa. So I think it's one of the motivations for this webinar is that as Africans, we are exposed to so many climate impacts, yet we don't see a solution coming from just us. There has to be some kind of intercontinental solidarity where those who are really driving the crisis also hold some accountability, and are held to some kind of standard that we are often held to. So thank you for that input. Please continue to raise your hand if you'd like to unmute and ask a question. But one of the questions coming from the chat, this is gonna be the last question for the session, and then we'll go back to our speakers. So the question is, where does the funding for all of this exploration, extraction, refining, and distribution projects across Africa come from? In theory, most big banks have committed to stop funding fossil fuels. Multilateral banks like IMF, EDB, and other have done the same. But the money seems to flow into African gas projects. Where does it come from? Again, great question, and I hope Amy's still on the call. Perhaps we can also share some of the work that we've been doing in the Fair Finance Coalition. But yeah, for now, let me hand back to Dean, Lorraine, and Esther, whoever would like to go first. Esther, I do see your camera on, so maybe you can go first.
Yes, I can, if nobody else wants to, yeah. So yeah, on the funding question, it's a very good one, and I'm thinking very hard here actually, because I know a bit what's happening. I mean, how new infrastructure projects are being financed in the EU, and there is some public money which is going to be made available with this Repower EU project, which came like quite of an earthquake after the Russian war, and sort of coming with proposals for modifications and amendments on existing law. And one of them is, for instance, we had with the COVID crisis, we had the recovery and resilience funds which have been put together, and part of that money is going to be is in the course of being renegotiated to be made available for financing these new fossil gas infrastructure projects that the EU is building also inside. It's developing inside the EU. For instance, I mean, there's a huge sort of protection shield, if you wish, around Germany being built up of LNG terminals. Germany alone is building 12 new LNG terminals, floating terminals, and they are, for the time being, partly financed by public national money, German money. But there is a possibility to claim part of that back via those recovery funds, for instance. So now when it comes to projects which are outside the EU and which financed in Africa, I actually don't know whether when Kadri Simpson goes to Algeria, whether she's committing money, and I don't know if the MOU between the EU and Egypt and Namibia, for instance, is promising money? And if so, I think that's then not happening via those EU funds, but maybe via, I actually don't know, so I'm going into speculation. We know that there's, I mean, the big companies are there as well, so I'm wondering to what extent this is also not private money. I don't know if somebody else, I see a hand here, if somebody else wants to raise, add something on the finance discussion, which I think is really interesting. Otherwise, I can also come back to the hydrogen imports thing, but let's keep going maybe with the finance question, if that's still alive here.
Yeah, I think that's a good way. Dean, I saw you raise your hand, but I'm not sure if Dean has now dropped off the call. Oh, Dean, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, I can't put my video back on. Fossil gases have proven to be unreliable because there's now load shedding in South Africa. In terms of finance, I mean, we can only speculate, as the previous speaker mentioned. But one thing we also need to also understand is the fact that gas is being labeled as a green and clean energy. And the mistake that we've made for years is we most likely focused a lot on oil and gas, I mean, oil and coal, when we were doing our campaigns and our strategies. And that really provided a platform for gas to thrive. So basically, we're defeated by semantics. And because of that, you will find most likely public finance institutions, if you look at most of their position statements, it's really saying phasing out coal, phasing out oil. There's very little mention on gas, so there's not really been really a strong stance on gas, you know, in terms of how that's being financed. So that being said, if countries like Germany, who hold large shares in the East European Investment Bank, in the African Development Bank, are seeing gas as a clean energy, and they hold such significant shares within public finance institutions, then the answer is yes, most likely the money will be funded. If we're going to think around the World Bank, and who have got a president who is a climate denier and doesn't really understand or acknowledge what climate change really looks like in the context of the global south or even the world itself, then obviously the head of the World Bank is going to continue to finance gas specifically. And another thing that we also need to start being cognizant of is the fact that, you know, the Just Energy Transition Fund partnership grants being sent into South Africa, for example, that 8.5 billion, for example, it could come with conditions, right? And that condition being the next transition fuel is gas. And grounded on that, remember, where it's not been established whether those funds are loans or concessions or whatever they may be, they might come with their own structural adjustments, which may be, again, be grounded on gas. And lastly, the private sector is very much heavily invested into this. And that also speaks towards the fact that there's not really been any transparency and accountability by public finance institutions to report as to how funds flow in and out of public finance institutions. For example, they could pay a certain entity a certain amount of money, but there's no accountability after that in terms of the intermediaries and subsidiaries that fall under that entity A, for example, of which how that money is then distributed. So we do see these subsets of money then being recycled into different projects that then are grounded on fossil fuels as a result of the lack of transparency and accountability of how funds are distributed by public finance institutions. Despite there being evidence of tracking, it is still not really effective and robust, and that's something that still has to be improved. So we are being caught up in a cycle, you know, of precarity, for the lack of a better word. And at this stage, as mentioned by the previous speaker, we can only speculate. But I do believe once we all connect the dots, and COP27 will also really provide that, we will truly see how truly there is a just energy transition fund. We will truly see whether or not there is a commitment to abandon and produce a fossil fuel finance exclusion policy.
Thank you so much, Dean. And I think a very good point about the EU, taxonomy change, and I think it's really important to understand what that means on the ground. It means that a lot of European countries will be claiming to be participating in a just transition while still fueling the climate crisis, of which, as we have mentioned, Africa will unfortunately carry the burden for. So again, it's that neo-colonial project of calling for something in one place, but not actually doing that on the ground. And I think it's a very fair point as well to talk about the JP. I think it's a different discussion, but it's a point worth making in a conversation like this, that a lot of the loans or the money coming into African countries comes with conditions, and often locks African countries into debt cycles. And this is something that South Africa is facing right now, where we have this 8.5 billion on the table, but civil society and communities don't know anything around how that money will be paid back, if it is necessary to be paid back. So again, this idea that when we talk about climate change, and even when we talk about financing and about gas, about what is the next transition fuel, we have to always keep in mind that history of colonialism and that history of dispossession. Because it allows us to see the perspectives, to see the issue with a nuanced perspective. And I do see that, just to move now from the financing, but the last comment on financing is that I see that Amy has shared a link in the chat. It is to the bank track article, and I think it's really important that we know that development finance institutions in South Africa, including the African Development Bank, are still involved in fossil fuels and largely still involved in gas exploration. And as development finance institutions and public finance institutions, there is a different mandate that they have, a mandate of development, which they are not at the moment realizing. So thank you for those inputs. Umar Ali, you have your hand up, so I'm going to give you the space to speak, and then we'll get back to another question from the chat. Umar Ali, your hand is raised. Okay, maybe he has stepped away. Oh, he has sent a question in the chat, so I'm going to just read that. Climate activists here in Nigeria are doing the best they can't do great measures to prevent climate deserts. Why are countries who are responsible for this problem just ignoring this? Isn't that deceptive for the UN to fight climate impacts? I think if anyone has a comment on that, around how the burden really placed on climate activists to fight these things, when massive institutions, including the UN, including the World Bank, are not necessarily doing as much as they can on this issue. There was another question around also touching on the colonialism question. So the question is, social and economic problems that arise from fossil fuel exploration are rooted or linked in one way or another to past injustices, such as slavery, colonialism, or cultural genocide. The continuation of these is called coloniality, as they maintain uneven material and social conditions, even though colonialism has officially ended. Considering that this is clear in this situation as well, and that the situation thrives in a capitalist system, what are we doing as climate and environmental activists, or what can we do to configure some kind of alternative economic system? Yeah. Dean, and Lorraine, also please feel free to come through with any of your inputs. Dean?
Sure. I think I can tackle briefly Omar's question and really answer it basic and plain, that, the way the United Nations is structured regarding international law is that countries really enjoy what is commonly referred to as state sovereignty. Meaning that despite, for example, if the UN was to push for a motion to, let's say, phase out fossil fuels, it all boils down to the country on whether or not in their sovereignty and the nature of their sovereignty that they would adopt that. So the UN cannot necessarily force countries to adopt a certain resolution, which is some of the problems that we faced when the Paris Agreement was signed, because initially countries like America, I don't even know whether they've signed or not, but I'm just using as an example because they never signed it initially, and it took a while for them to actually be on board regarding that. And that really speaks to around how the UN is structured. And again, when it comes to decisions that are bounding, then we've got the issue around the UN Security Council, which is governed by the top 5 countries who've got permanent seats. And those countries, again, happen to be the same countries that are dashing for gas while the other one is invading another country. So there's this whole power of politics at play that really cannot be manifested into how we understand what climate justice may look like. So we are bound by international law norms. And then again, we have then the other 7 countries that are part of the UN Security Council. But let's just say a motion was passed within the United Nations Security Council. There's the veto power that can easily, for example, Russia can easily say no. And once that's that, because of how the UN is structured, that motion will not be passed. So, for example, there's the Non-Fossil Fuel Proliferation Treaty right now that's being used as an alternative. But here's the thing, no matter how many endorsements it gets, which is very important and very great, for it to hold countries liable, they have to ratify that. And for countries to ratify that, that is a decision solely based on what the country feels like at that time, which is why it's very important to most likely, if we're to use the UN route, to try pushing for countries that want to set an example. So for example, in Africa, that would be ideally be countries like Kenya, who are already running on 92% renewable energy. So they would probably be champions for such a treaty, for example. But really, basically, in plain terms, how UN is structured and being bound by international law, it is really not feasible to use the route of pushing for that. Yes, there are frameworks that exist, but we have to consider state sovereignty.
Just to come in there, my concern is that as long as we're using capitalist logic to try and get out of the climate crisis, we're going nowhere, because it is this type of global economic system that has put us where we are. If we look at how corporate power has been unfettered, there's been deregulation at every point, from having free trade zones to having open trade, these spaces that are mushrooming up, and this whole process of globalizing capitalism. So as long as we're trying to place climate action, as Naomi Klein put it, that as long as we're trying to place climate action into capitalism, that is not going to work. We need to take out climate action and our solutions out of capitalist logic. That way we can then find solutions that are sustainable, that will allow us to reverse the effects of climate change. And again, one point that is highlighted is global and rich nations need to be actually reducing their emissions by 8 to 10% each year for us to try and reverse the impacts of global warming and climate change. But instead, no one is giving considerations into this. Year by year, we are always attending these climate negotiations, climate talks, and each year it takes many years for countries to come to an agreement, because each rich nation is trying to assert its position as an economic powerhouse. And so no one is willing to actually say, look, we need to reduce consumption. We need to reduce extractivism. We need to go back and form a relationship with nature. Invest in people's livelihoods, in people's economy, where the environment can also thrive. No one is willing to have that kind of discussion. So again, like as was asked by one of the participants from Nigeria, it is going to be as business as usual. I do not see any change with regards to the logic, because it's still all extractivism. Gas extraction, like I mentioned, it's not for African people. It's not an African agenda to begin with, because it has not been derived after a process of consultation with people. Even if you look at all the chart that was shown by the presentation earlier on, which showed the chart where gas extraction is going to happen, there haven't been any prior consultation. All those free, prior, informed consent have been thrown out of the window. And we are all reacting to this emergency where we have to quickly invest in gas. Deals are being signed. Who scrutinized those deals? Has anyone had a chance to look at the deals, assess them, look at the impacts that those deals we have on Africa? So again, our focus is kind of skewed, I mean, as a global community in terms of looking at the impacts and also the capitalist agenda. So thanks for that, for the question. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. Yes, I think it's kind of an elephant in the room with climate activists, and I think we need to be a lot more clearer that the solutions to the climate crisis are not going to come out of capitalism, and that it is very necessary for us to move to a new economic system that actually serves people and is able to serve both climate and environmental, but also human needs. So thank you for that. So we are running out of time, and I don't see too many more questions. And I see Esther also has to leave. So if there are no more points of questions, I'm going to end it here. Esther, before you leave, there was a question around how to get involved with CAN International. And I think the same goes for Don't Gas Africa. So if we could maybe just have, if you could pop an email or a link in the chat where people can contact you, Lorraine and Dean, if you could do the same. And yeah, I just want to once again say thank you to the panelists. And just to have a quick recap, we've heard about the historical dispossession and how gas exploration presents itself as this neo-colonial project, how gas will not meet people's needs, and how this compromises all of our abilities to reach the Paris goals, and not just Africa, but Europe as well. We also heard about the need for collaboration and solidarity across continents, and the need for us to dispel the myth that gas is green. I think ahead of COP, it's a very important conversation, and we hope that, especially in the context of this being Africa's COP, we hope that amongst other topics such as loss and damage and fair finance for climate solutions, that the gas question is actually answered, and that the African narrative is told. So I just want to once again say thank you to everyone that joined us. I think it's really inspiring to see such a number of people attending and participating in this webinar. From the African branch, thank you so much to the Europe branch for this collaboration. I think this is the start of more collaborative work between the branches of Climate Reality Project. And thank you to our panelists for your really, really valuable inputs. Yeah, so thank you everyone. The live stream is on both the branches' Facebooks, and we have a recording as well. So if you want to share with any of your organizations, please feel free to share the link. And thank you, everybody. Feel free to come off mute and say goodbye.
Good one, thank you, well done.
Thanks, bye.
Interesting, and it would be great to get the presentations, actually, if that's possible.
Sure, yeah, definitely.
It'd be nice if you did the presentations to the banks. We went to the banks and gave each executive team of managers at each bank a presentation similar to this. It would be a nice thing.
Thanks, Julie.
Okay, cheers.
Bye. Thank you.
Cheers,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you so much. Very insightful presentation.
Hi, Bertha.
How are you? Thank you so much. Very insightful. Thank you.